Now
Got it.
we are. Yep.
There we go.
Awesome.
Hi there and welcome everyone. Thank you so much for being here. As you come into the space, we'll give folks a few more minutes. My name is Rashonda Lanier Jackson, and I serve as the Community Engagement Manager at PlanRVA. We have the amazing Renee Haltman here, and I'm just so excited to introduce her and tell you more about her in a little bit. So we'll give folks a few more minutes to sign in, and then we will get started. But thank you so much for being here. Well, good afternoon again. My name is Rashonda Lanier Jackson, and I serve as the Community Engagement Manager here at PlanRVA. We will go ahead and get started. So if you're joining us for the first time, PlanRVA is where the region comes together to look ahead. So we were established in 1969, and we were known as the Richmond Regional Planning District Commission, has been home of cooperation among the 9 jurisdictions of Central Virginia for more than 50 years. Today, we focus in areas of community development, emergency management, the environment, and transportation. We are the seer of the future, convener of our member jurisdictions and regional partners. We are the creator of plans of actions and shaper of Central Virginia's future. So we like to believe that tomorrow's solutions are born here. Today, I have the pleasure of introducing our dynamic and amazing Renee Haltman. Renee is Vice President and Regional Executive at the Federal Reserve Bank of Richmond. Her work involves engaging business, banking, and community leaders on local economic conditions to inform the monetary policy-making process, as well as sharing information about the Federal Reserve System. Renee is based at the Richmond office and has responsibility for public outreach and engagement in Virginia, as well as for the Community Depository Institutions Advisory Council. Renee joined the Richmond Fed in 2009 as an economic writer in the research department, often with a focus on monetary policy and macroeconomics and the Federal Reserve. She most recently served as editorial content manager for the research publications team and was editor of Econ Focus magazine from 2015 to 2018. Renee previously worked in the research and public information departments of the Federal Reserve Bank of San Francisco, providing education on monetary policy and the Fed system to a variety of audiences. Renee has a bachelor's degree in economics from Michigan State University and a master's degree in economics from the University of San Francisco. Welcome, Renee. We are so glad to have you.
I'm so glad to be here. Thank you so much for inviting me.
Absolutely. Now, before jumping into the presentation, I first want to understand and give the audience an understanding of why you do this work. What about it keeps you up at night?
Oh, that's I love that question. I'm extremely passionate about all things the Fed, which might sound weird to some people, but economics and the economy generally. I actually started out in education as an art major, much to my parents' dismay. And then I took an economics class and I just fell in love with it. It just made the world make sense to me in a way that I found really powerful. But I actually think that leads to why I do this work today, because part of my role involves explaining the complexity of the Fed and of the economy out to the public. And I think that context matters so much for people's decision making. And I love lending that clarity to people wherever I can. And in the course of that work, I spend a lot of my days talking with people on the ground, from business leaders to community leaders, trying to understand the different economic circumstances that they face. And I share that information back into the leadership within the Richmond Fed. So I'm helping to give people a voice in a way that feels very gratifying to me. That's my way of doing public service. And I think back to the last few years in COVID, when everything was uncertain, no one knew what was going on, no one knew how to understand anything because it was so unprecedented. So just the ability to talk to people on the ground and really hear their stories and make sure our policymakers were hearing that, and then to share that information back out to hopefully help them all is just a very gratifying mission. And I really appreciate the ability to do it, the opportunity to serve the public in this way. And just the Federal Reserve as an institution, it's an institution of utmost integrity. So I could talk about that all day, but I won't. So.
No, I appreciate that, Renee. Thank you. That is such a crucial and essential role. I think we see that here at PlanRVA as well when we're, coming up with policies or plans, trying to translate it in a way that it makes sense to our elected leaders and all the way down to our communities, our residents. So thank you. So for everyone joining us today, thank you so much. Please feel free to add your questions in the chat, and that's here in the Zoom. If you are on YouTube, we do have staff that are monitoring YouTube as well. Our team will be monitoring the chat for any issues or questions, and we'll have time near the end of the hour for questions from you all. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Renee, and let's jump into the presentation.
All right, thanks so much. So thanks again, everybody. I'm going to actually go ahead and share my slides, so bear with for just a moment. Okay. Rashonda, can you see that okay?
I can. Thanks, Renee.
Okay, great. So what I'm going to talk about today is a little bit of what I said in the introduction, an overview of where the economy is today. And in the course of my work here at the Richmond Fed, I've spent a lot of time in the Richmond community, become very passionate about the Richmond community as well. And so I'm going to share some things that I see as maybe opportunities for the Richmond community going forward. And I've really appreciated my partnership with PlanRVA and that just the ability to talk about what we see going on in this community gives us so much insight into how the economy is working overall. So that's been a real honor for me. I'm so happy to be here. I can't hear or see the questions, so I'm trusting Rashonda to interrupt me if there's a pressing question. Otherwise, I'll try to leave time for questions at the end. And again, a lot of what I'm going to talk about today, I'm an economist by training, but it's also informed by my conversations with people out on the ground. So that gives us a much more real-time perspective on the economy and also a much richer understanding of what things are actually doing. So I'll kind of pepper in some anecdotes that I hear on the ground. So I'm going to talk about the overall economy. I'm going to touch on inflation, not that there's anything interesting to say there, and then go into regional conditions today. And before I dive in, I have to give the disclaimer that what I'm going to share today are my views and not those of the Federal Reserve Bank of Richmond or my colleagues in the Fed system. Okay, and with that, I will dive right in. And so before I jump into all of that, some of you might be wondering what or who the Richmond Fed even is. So I just wanted to spend one moment on that. The Richmond Fed is one of 12 regional Federal Reserve banks throughout the country. The Richmond Fed serves the district that you see on this slide. It's basically the Carolinas up through West Virginia and Maryland. And then we have 3 offices. Our head office is in Richmond, and we also have offices in Charlotte and in Baltimore. So it's a very diverse district that we cover. And then I, in particular, in my role, cover the state of Virginia. So I'm going to talk mostly about that today. And just for perspective, the Fed system has been around for about 100 years. And this picture shows our very first office in Richmond that opened in 1914 at 1109 East Main Street. And someone will have to tell me what's at that address now. So we've been around in a part of this community for quite a long time. And what the Fed does is we are the central bank of the country. We're best known for monetary policy, which is the Fed's role influencing interest rates in the economy to support the overall economy. That's sort of what we're best known for. But we have a few other functions here as well. We supervise and regulate banks. We conduct the, payments in the payment system, so moving cash and electronic transfers from point A to point B. And then we also have a role in community development through the Community Reinvestment Act of 1974 that gives us a role supporting the needs of low and moderate income communities. A lot of it through our research and our analysis and our ability to convene people in particular ways. So that's sort of the scope of the work that we do. And there's a visual on the slide that shares the broad impact that the Fed's activities have overall on people in the economy. And so we take our role very seriously, and that's why this sort of outreach that we do is really important to give us a clear understanding of what's really happening in the economy. So with that level set out of the way, I'm going to dive into economic conditions as I see them. And this is sort of the one slide summary of where we are. And, there are times when it's harder to explain what's going on in the economy, but I think these days it's somewhat simple. We've had really, really hot demand in the economy for some time with limited supply. And anytime you have those two things happening for a long period of time, you're going to get inflationary pressures. And that's what we're experiencing now. So how did we get here? In COVID, demand surged for a number of reasons. We stayed home and had nothing to do but buy things on Amazon, shopped online. So goods demand surged through the roof. And all that was supported by a lot of fiscal policy transfers that were designed to support the economy through COVID. And remember, through the course of that time period, those couple of years, there was so much uncertainty about how long it would last and who was really hurt the most and which sectors would recover and when. And so rightly so, we put a lot of fiscal support into the economy, and we're seeing that in the demand that resulted. And at the same time, monetary policy, our interest rates were very low as well. So lots of demand happening in the economy, but the supply just wasn't there. COVID looked like a big shock to supply, meaning we sent a bunch of workers home and they couldn't work. So supply was really limited. And on top of that, COVID really disrupted supply chains throughout the world. And we're still dealing with both of those conditions. I would say supply is recovering slowly, but it just takes a lot of time. And so on top of that, global commodity price swings, in part fueled by the war in Ukraine, didn't help, really added some additional pressure there. So all of that going on has produced where we are today. And so the upshot of where we are is that supply and demand are starting to come back into better balance. In particular, on the demand side, it is coming down and moderating. From my perspective, when that happens is the question. When do those two come back into better balance? And in the meantime, do we get inflation under control? We think we will, but what does that look like? How quickly? And then how quickly does that mean we need to raise interest rates? So that's the overall economic context, and I'll give you a lot more detail and data. Richmond overall mirrors the nation in a lot of ways, but we do have some particular trends, in particular with our jobs recovery, which has been slower. And so I'm going to talk a little about that toward the end. Okay, so diving into the data. So this chart shows gross domestic product. It's our broadest measure of the economy. GDP growth is kind of our number one way of looking at how the economy is doing. And what you can see on this chart is that over time, we tend to grow at about 2% in our economy. That's sort of a good, sustainable growth rate. You can see COVID threw that way out of whack. We had a huge decline and then a huge recovery. And then we've had really rapid growth since COVID, and that's that demand that I talked about. Now, we have had a couple of negative quarters of growth this year, and you can see that on the right-hand bars of the chart, dipping into negative territory. And one of the things we get asked a lot is, well, doesn't 2 negative quarters of growth mean a recession? And that's not the technical definition of a recession. There's actually a committee of economists that makes the official call of whether and when we're in a recession, and they've not said that we are in one. And frankly, if that was a recession, it's the strangest recession I've ever seen, because even though GDP was declining, you had jobs growing really fast, you had incomes growing and hours worked, credit quality is really good, consumer health is better than ever in a lot of ways. And so there's a lot of ways in which this does not feel like a recession. So going forward, the outlook has cooled quite a bit. The red dots on the right-hand side of this chart are the forecasts of Fed policymakers. And so you can see that for the remainder of 2022, as well as next year, it's a pretty tepid forecast. I believe the numbers are 0.2% growth for this year and 1.2% next year. So that is a definite cooling from where we've been. But remember that where we've been has been a very hot pace and arguably not sustainable. And so some amount of cooling is exactly what we have been trying to achieve by raising interest rates in order to cool things down to a more sustainable level. So will we have a recession? It's possible. To my mind, it could be more like a cooling down to something more sustainable. All recessions don't have to feel like 2008, where it's a calamity and a huge spike in unemployment. So we don't really know how this is going to play out. We hope it's something more like a soft landing, but that's what we're eagerly watching now. And I'll come back to a chart in a minute that makes that point better, I think. So why was growth so strong? This chart shows a big reason why. This shows the personal saving rate of households. And you can see that it took a huge spike in COVID. What that meant was two things. Households were receiving a whole lot of checks from the government in terms of fiscal policy in support of COVID. And at the same time, we weren't going out to restaurants or taking vacations or even getting as many haircuts. And so households were sitting on a lot of added savings. And in fact, that is still the case. The households at the peak, the household sector was sitting on about $2 or $3 trillion in excess savings. So that's a lot of money to fuel spending. And so that's part of the reason we saw the demand that we have. Now the savings rate has recovered to more normal levels, and we're starting to dip into that pool of savings and drain it down. And when we do, it'll be really interesting to see what happens to demand going forward. But the strength of the consumer is a big part of the reason that we saw the growth that we've seen. And that is also shown in this chart, which shows consumption. That top line there, that dark blue line, that is 70% of the entire economy. It's what households spend, personal consumption expenditures. And then the bottom two lines are the two things that we can spend on. We can either spend on services, which is the middle line, or goods, which is the red line. You can see that what happened in COVID is that we stopped spending on services, took a huge dip, and it's kind of only barely recovered to pre-COVID levels because many of us still are not taking international vacations, right? There's still some ways in which we're holding back from services. By contrast, the goods line on the bottom, you can see it dipped a little bit in initial COVID, but then it surged way above pre-COVID levels. And so that's sort of what I mean by it might have been an arguably unsustainable level of demand. We really pushed the supply in our economy to its brink. And so as we're looking at the economy slowing now, I have this, in those red dotted lines, I have this question on this chart is, are we slowing down back to 2021 levels, which might feel maybe sustainable, it might feel good, more comfortable, in terms of supply and demand imbalance? Or are we slowing more to 2019 levels, say? And if it's a more distinct slowdown, then that might start to feel more like a recession, like we're accustomed to. So it's just to make this point that not all recessions are created equal. It just depends how much we are slowing things down in the economy. And just a note on supply chains, I don't have a chart on supply chains right now, but we all know supply chains have been massively disrupted in the economy. And I think you can see in this, when I talk with businesses every day, many of them have been telling me for the last 2 years that they would have been producing even more if they had been able to get the supply, get the inputs, or get the workers. And so if supply chains hadn't been disrupted, I think these numbers could have been even higher. So I think that's really telling about where we've been from a supply perspective. We just really pushed the economy past its potential. And so that's sort of overall economic activity, but then the labor market is a really interesting part of the story. So this chart shows jobs, the level of jobs we have in the economy. We lost about, I think it was 23 million jobs in March and April of 2020. So just incredible numbers of job losses. And remember how I showed you a few slides ago that we are far above pre-COVID economic activity, but with the same number of workers. So we're producing more and more and more, but with the same number of workers. And I think that's a really incredible fact. And so if for any employers watching, even governments, if you're feeling the tightness of the labor market, that's a big part of the reason why. We're producing a ton, but with fewer workers. And so there's a lot to say about this. And so I'm going to talk a little bit more, spend a moment on the labor market. So why on earth would labor feel so tight right now? What's going on here behind these numbers? And I'm going to give you two reasons why the labor market feels so tight. The first is that people left the labor force in COVID in huge numbers. So this shows the labor force participation rate. So it's the share of the population that either has a job or is looking for a job. And you can see that it took a big dive in COVID. Tons of people left labor force. And there's a lot of reasons why they did this. Many were laid off and they were just delayed looking for something new in the middle of a pandemic. Many people lacked childcare. And so that kept them out of the labor force. That particularly affected women in the initial days of COVID, and it continues to affect women of color. So that lack of childcare is a big piece. A lot of people had a fear of getting COVID, and so they didn't want to work. And I personally perceive from my conversations with businesses and even with peers that there's a whole lot of people who just said, pandemics are stressful. I'm going to make a different choice about work-life balance. And maybe I'm just going to not work for some time, go from being a 2-income family to a 1-income family. A lot of people made that choice. But actually, the biggest part of this number is retirees. And so that's some combination of, I don't want to get COVID at my age since I'm a high-risk group, or maybe I'm caring for my grandchildren, or maybe, hey, life is short, I don't want to work anymore and I'm just going to leave the labor force. And so I think there's a bit of pessimism in this chart. We have recovered some of the losses in the size of the labor force, but a lot of what you see in this chart is really demographics. And COVID, I think, there's good reason to think that COVID just accelerated a bunch of retirements that were already underway. So in other words, I don't know how much this number is going to recover. I don't know how likely it is that we're going to get to pre-COVID levels of the size of the labor force. And so what that means is we all, as a society, and particularly as regions, have to think really hard about how we engage workers and how we get people engaged in the labor force and keep them there. And every region I talk to in Virginia is really focused on how to draw workers, how to make their homes an attractive place for people to be, because workers are scarce right now. We've sort of been in a world where any employer could just find the workers they needed for decades. We've been in that place, and now it feels sort of fundamentally tighter, and some of that tightness could stay, I think, for some time. Just to put a fine point on that, this shows labor force participation by a few different types of groups. And you'll see that for younger workers, ages 25 to 34, their labor force participation has recovered. And it's the same for people with a college education. But on the bottom 2 panels of the chart, people 55 and up, their labor force participation is still quite low. And if you were to break that one down, it's in particular people 65 and up and 70 and up. And I don't know how likely many of them are to come back to the labor force. It'd be great if they did, but I think that's an open question. And then on the bottom right-hand panel, the group of people with a high school degree but no college, they are still not back in the labor force to the same degree that they were. And I don't know exactly what's going on there. It's probably some combination of incentives, like maybe that added fiscal support helps some people stay home. Maybe a lot of it's childcare. Maybe they live in places where they don't feel they have the opportunity that's the right match for them. So there's a lot of things going on there, but engaging people back into the workforce is key for our whole economy, but for any region that wants to succeed coming out of this, that's going to be key. And so the second reason that labor feels really tight right now is that there is an incredible amount of churn happening in the economy. And by that, I mean people leaving their old job to find new jobs. So even if they're still in the labor force, just churn within the labor force. So the top line has in this chart has made a lot of headlines. That's the job openings rate. And you can see that it's at historic levels. There's currently about 2 open jobs for every 1 unemployed person in the economy, which is pretty extraordinary when you think about it. The red line is the hires rate, which has not kept pace nearly as much. And the bottom line is the one that's really interesting. That's the quits rate. So the rate at which people are leaving their jobs. And people don't leave their jobs unless they're pretty confident that they're going to be able to find a new one. So there's something going on right now where people are just perceiving that there's a better option out there. And it looks like a lot of different things, why people might be leaving their jobs. Some of it may have been people leaving their sector entirely, saying, maybe I don't want to work at a hotel or at a bar in a pandemic, right? Maybe I don't want to be in leisure and hospitality and I want to go somewhere else. A lot of it is things like, I want to be remote and my employer doesn't want me to be remote, or I don't want to be vaccinated and my employer wants me to be vaccinated. And also, I think just this perception that there's so many job openings out there, as you can see on this chart. And if I look for a new job, maybe I can get a better deal, right? Maybe I can find a higher wage. And there's a lot of data showing that people who have left their jobs in COVID have higher wage rates than people who stayed at their jobs. So there's some truth to this idea of people looking for a better match out there. And this fever pitch in the labor market has come down some. Employers are telling me that labor doesn't feel quite as tight as it did before. So I think some of this, it may be alleviating. Some of that may be about a fear of a recession and people saying, maybe I need to bank on stability. I think another piece of it is that wages have really adjusted, right? In the leisure and hospitality sector in particular, when a bunch of people left that sector, wages really rose, right? And it drove some people back. And so ultimately, wages, I think, are going to settle this market, but it very much isn't done yet. We're still trying to figure out as a society, who's going to win this race between remote workforce versus hybrid versus in person. We haven't fully figured it out yet. And I think that's sort of a long-term question because the culture within a workplace evolves slowly. And I think we're just still figuring out as a society what that's going to look like. So still more action to come here. There's still a lot of wage pressure out there from this effect. And also then it becomes this self-fulfilling prophecy, because as wages rise, that leads employers to want to raise prices. But then employees say things are more expensive out there, I want higher wages. And so this wage price spiral is something we spend a lot of time thinking about and want to stem and make sure it doesn't happen. And so on that note, I'm going to dive into the outlook for inflation. And so I've described an economy with a lot of demand and then supply struggling to meet it, which is a textbook model for higher prices. Any economics textbook will say that. And for a long time, the Fed had a hard time getting inflation high enough. Our target is at 2%, and inflation was stubbornly low. And now we are very much in the opposite situation. And for those who may not know, when we conduct monetary policy and move interest rates around, we have two goals: maximum employment and stable prices. And those are the goals given to us by Congress. So we spend a lot of time thinking about the labor market and a lot of time thinking about inflation. And in particular, on the inflation side, the Fed cannot respond when it's just one or two prices, when it's just the price of gas or just the price of milk. What we have to pay attention to is sustained increases in overall prices over time. And the reason we focus on that is that interest rates are a very blunt instrument. We don't have any tool for bringing down gas prices or bringing down housing prices. We can't really target different markets. All we can affect is the overall environment in which prices are set. So we have to look at the sort of overall inflation, and then 2% is our target. And the inflation we've seen has come from three places, and that's described in the middle part of this chart. And therefore, inflation is going to come down in those three ways. Number one is going to be demand and supply balancing. And demand is mainly where the Fed operates. When we raise interest rates, it makes it more expensive to invest and to spend. And so we influence demand. We don't really have a lot of tools to affect supply, although it sure would be nice if we did. Supply is just more of a slow recovering factor right now. So we operate through demand, and demand and supply coming back into balance will be one way inflation comes down. The second way will be wage pressures receding, which the overall demand environment will influence that, but then also just labor markets finding their new equilibrium, that will influence that as well. And then the third is global commodity prices moderating, and many of them have, which is good news, but many of them are still quite elevated. So those are the three channels through which we'll be watching inflation come down. And all three of those are in progress of coming back down, but they're really hard to forecast. And my prediction is that inflation is not going to come down fast or smoothly. It's probably going to be bumpy. There's probably going to be a few months of us having to look at the data and scour and try to understand what's really going on. And that's probably how it's going to happen. But this is our top priority at the Fed. So I hope we instill the trust of you all that we are on top of this problem. Whoops. Okay, and so just to give you a picture of what inflation looks like and how we think about it. So this is what people are talking about. This is inflation. We look at two measures here. This is the Consumer Price Index. It's one of the key measures of inflation. There's another one that we look at as well, but I'm showing you only one today. They tell a similar story. That red line is overall inflation. It's the entire basket of goods and services that people buy. And you can see that it is elevated. It's very, very high. And the last report that we had was not very optimistic. Inflation came down a bit on the goods side, but it seemed more persistent. And then the blue line is core inflation. And that takes out food and energy prices, not because they aren't important, but because they wiggle around so much that it's hard to understand the trend if you're including them. So we look at both of these to see where inflation is going. And you can see the most recent month of data, core inflation actually ticked up. which was not something that we're happy with. And again, remember that the Fed's target is 2% inflation. So this is far above where we want to be. And it is, I mean, there are signs that inflation could be coming down. And certainly when I talk with businesses, I hear very much this theme of, gosh, I can't push through prices the same way I could before. They're feeling a little more pushback from customers, and that's a good thing. I think that's a sign of markets moderating. What you don't want is a situation where businesses think, oh yeah, I can push through any price I want and no one cares, because everyone just knows that inflation is going to be 8%. So they expect it. And so they're just planning for it. We hope that market discipline kind of pushes inflation back down. And we are seeing signs of that based on the conversations with businesses. But still, this is a particular thing that we're watching. And this inflation affects everyone. Some particular ways I'd say it affects governments include the cost of services, certainly, including building and materials. Everyone's focused on infrastructure spending now, and that building and any kind of building is more costly. Inflation, as I said, tends to lead to wage pressure. And what we're finding and hearing is the government sector often has less scope to raise wages. Often there's just a different set of requirements and sort of red tape from doing so. And so we've seen government employment in particular really struggle, I think in part because governments have less ability to raise wages. And then inflation can also affect financing costs for governments as well in terms of how much they borrow, just the overall environment of interest rates. And then inflation also could affect state and local government finances depending where you source your revenue. If you source revenue from sales tax, then that might actually move with inflation. But if it's something like property taxes or other things, you might get less revenue because of what's happening here. So this is just a really important factor. And as my president, Tom Barkin, likes to say, one thing we've learned with certainty in the last year is that everyone hates inflation. Businesses don't like dealing with it. Businesses actually don't like raising prices because it upsets their customers. A lot of resources get spent trying to figure out what things cost, haggling. It's not a fun process. Things are much more comfortable for everybody when prices are kind of low and steady and predictable. And then certainly households hate inflation too, because it affects their ability to pay for goods and services. So this is just a serious problem. And just to give you a little bit of insight into how we look at inflation. So this shows month-to-month inflation and breaks it down into the categories of inflation. So you can see what particular parts of inflation are growing. And if you were to go back to, say, mid-2021, the single biggest category of inflation was that gray bar. So that's right around the middle of this chart. That gray bar was really big. That alone was used cars, the contribution to inflation. And that was very clearly a pandemic story. We couldn't get microchips in new cars, so that pushed all the demand into used cars and their prices rose. So from the Fed's perspective, we look at that and we say, like, we can't really respond to used car prices because we have no ability to affect the microchip supply chain, right? So we are kind of saying this is problematic, but it's not something we can really respond to. But then toward the fall of last year, you started to see inflation get more persistent and more broad-based. So in particular, I'll draw your eyes to that green bar, which is everything else. And that green bar got bigger and more persistent across months. And then the pink bar is another one I'll draw your attention to. That is rent, so the cost of housing. And that is very persistent now, as I think anyone reading the news or trying to buy a house knows. Rents and housing prices both are rising and high. And what's troubling about that indicator is that it's lagging. Rents, for example, typically readjust only once a year. And so it's something that doesn't come down super fast. So we are watching all of these categories of inflation to understand, are we making progress in bringing inflation down? And just to get a little bit wonky for just a moment, and then I'll dive into regional conditions. This shows the trajectory of the Fed's interest rates. So this is at the forecast from Fed policymakers, and each dot is one individual person on the Fed's policy committee. So my president is one of those dots, but they're anonymous, and I don't know which one he is, just to paint the picture. And so for 2022, you can see that the Fed policymakers are still expecting rates to rise this year. So more rate increases. That I put a little red star on where the Fed's policy rate is today and a little bit more room to grow. And they're even expecting rates to grow more next year. before hopefully getting inflation back down and coming back down to sort of long-term sustainable interest rate levels in the long run. So just to show there's still a little scope yet for raising interest rates further because inflation is such a big problem. One of the things that we learned from the inflation of the 1970s is that what you don't want to do is raise interest rates and then say, oh goodness, there's a recession, and then lower interest rates. Because if you haven't really tamed the inflation beast, it comes back even higher. So we've been signaling, Fed policymakers have been signaling very strongly that we are going to raise rates and keep them there until we know that inflation's coming back down, because you end up just creating more problems, more deeper economic problems if you don't do that. Okay, so that was sort of the summary of the economy. Just going forward, the one thing I'd say is that we care if we enter a recession, but we have to be, at the Fed, have to be driven primarily by what inflation does. So the outlook for inflation is going to drive interest rate policy, not so much do we technically fall into a recession. Of course, those things will be related to one another, but really inflation is our number one goal. I just wanted to leave you with that thought. And so now you're probably wondering how the region is doing within all of this. And the overall trends are basically the same, but Richmond does have some key differences that I'd like to share. So generally, Richmond has recovered more slowly, and that's true for the state as well. So this shows job growth indexed to February of 2020. So it shows where we've dipped to and recovered to in the COVID experience. And Virginia and Richmond did not lose as many jobs initially in COVID, and then we had a quick boost back initially. But since about late 2020, and in Virginia, our growth has sort of dropped off and been much slower since, and you've had a much steeper recovery for the nation as a whole. So we're down currently more jobs in Richmond than the nation as a whole. So what's going on in Richmond and Virginia, you could say? And at least some of it is going to be explained by our industry structure. So this shows the share of jobs that each industry has for the US, Virginia, and for Richmond. And a few things to show is that number one, in Richmond, we are a pretty diverse economy, which tends to be pretty good for us, right? When you have a recession, economies that are diverse tend to do better and not fall quite as far. So that tends to be a good thing. We are more dependent on the government sector. That's down there in the bottom. You can see that our green bar is longer than the nation as a whole. We're also pretty dependent on professional and business services. So those are sort of office type jobs like lawyers and accountants and that sort of thing. We're very dependent on that sector, as well as education and health services. So those are sectors where we are higher than the nation in terms of share of jobs. So that's going to give you some indication of what sectors to look closely at in terms of how they're performing. And so then looking at how they're performing, this chart on the top panel shows how much each of those sectors is down in jobs. And so if you recall that in Richmond, we rely a lot on government jobs, especially state and local government jobs. And that's a sector that's down a lot. In fact, state and local government employment is a sector that continued to bleed jobs through a lot of COVID. And that's the sector where we're down the most. It's more important to us in Richmond as a share of our total jobs. But if you look at finance, we're actually still down a lot in finance jobs as well, whereas the sector for the nation as a whole is up quite a lot. I personally don't know why we're down so many finance jobs in Richmond. I'd love the perspective of others who maybe have thought about which particular firms may have come and gone in Richmond, but that's a factor pulling down our job growth. If you go to the bottom part of the Richmond panel, leisure and hospitality, we're doing relatively well there. We're actually up 4,000 jobs in leisure and hospitality, but it's a less important sector to our region than it is for the nation as a whole. Professional and business services is also up quite a lot in Richmond, but in percent terms, which you can see, I know it's very small on that bottom panel, we're up in professional and business services, but it's up a lot more in percent terms nationally. So we haven't recovered as much in that sector as the nation has. So overall, you can point to different industries to talk about what's going on in Richmond. I can't tell you one single reason why our job growth has been slower. And that's true for the state as a whole. I think there's a number of things going on. And by the way, to give some comfort, I suppose, Richmond isn't alone. It's true across metro areas of the state that they're growing slower than the nation generally. Up at the top, you see Blacksburg and Winchester, and there's some unique things going on in those economies. They've been small, high growth economies for some time, but a lot of the MSAs in Virginia have slower growth than the nation as a whole. And I hear a lot of theories as to why in Virginia. One could be that Virginia doesn't have the high growth metro areas that other states have. It could be the proximity to the federal government. Maybe that's something that keeps us relatively stable in recessions, which is good, but maybe just isn't that high growth. That could be part of it. If you talk to economic developers, they'll say that it's site development throughout the state as well as marketing. And it could be, I've even heard some people say, maybe in Virginia, we are just stable because of the federal government influence, and maybe we just haven't had the same crises that other states have had that have caused them to have to get really serious about growth in a different way and take some big risks. So, I think this is an open question, and I'd love to hear perspectives around the table. But I do want to share one important factor, and I think this leads into the conversation about what Richmond can do. One important factor holding back growth, and I don't have Richmond local data on this, only state data, but the labor force dropped for the nation as a whole, and it dropped even more in Virginia and has not recovered. So this shows that same labor force participation figure. And whereas the nation as a whole has started to recover quite a bit, Virginia just kept losing workers. And we've come back up in some recent months, but not nearly to where we were before. And so again, this underscores that point that regions and states that are able to engage and attract workers, I think are going to fare better coming out of this. And I think that's something that for all of us to pay attention to. And when I travel throughout the state, as I said, every region is obsessed with attracting workers right now. So we're not alone in this plight. So I just want to take a step back though. So aside from business cycles, how do we know if a region is doing well versus not? Because really what any of us care about is the well-being of our citizens, right? So at the Fed, I've got a particular job. I've got to think about inflation and employment, but any of us really just care about how well people are doing, right? So I just wanted to give you a flavor of some of the particular things I see as I travel throughout our district. And in particular, we see some communities thriving and others really struggling, and there are some common themes we can pull out. So I hope some of this resonates. I hope we can engage more on this in the future. And I welcome your pushback if I'm missing things too. I mean, that's how we learn. So feedback is eagerly received. Okay, so one measure of well-being that we look at is the share of the population that has a job. And this is just a really good catch-all measure of well-being in a region. Employment isn't everything, and quality of employment matters a lot. But this measure is correlated with a lot of things that we care about, a lot of things that do matter. So this is sort of this catch-all measure. And when you look at the share of the population that's employed, there is incredible variation across the state, ranging from, in some places, just 35% of the population employed to north of 75%. So it varies a lot. And even if you were to take out retirement age people, these variations roughly hold. So there's something fundamentally different happening across regions. Richmond does fairly well by this measure. It's in the second to highest category on average. On average, this is true for urban areas in general. Rural areas tend to have weaker outcomes, and we have a whole research team that focuses on rural areas in particular. So Richmond, on average, does better, but then let me show you, even within the Richmond MSA, there's a lot of variation. There's parts of the Richmond MSA with much lower employment outcomes, including the urban core. You might think of as the urban core in Richmond, where there are places where just half the population has a job. So the takeaway here is that even within regions, there's a lot of disparity to address. And one answer could be to bring jobs to a region, which of course economic developers work hard at doing. But I think the labor shortage of the last few years has shown us is that even when there are jobs, some workers sit on the sidelines. And so that's what I want to spend just one minute talking about further. So what are some things that keep workers on the sidelines? And I can put them into two buckets. And the economics of this are simple. If we have more people in the labor force, our economy has a greater ability to grow over time. That's true at the local level. It's true at the national level. And so, they're putting these things that hold people out of the workforce into two buckets. One is skill barriers like education and training. Education is highly, highly correlated with every labor market outcome you can imagine, whether it's employment, unemployment, whether you're in the labor force, median income. And so it's a really important measure. And it's not just education, but connecting people with training and with pathways to education. And by education as well, it doesn't just mean a college degree. Of course, it means skilled trades, credentials, associate's degrees as well. If 40% of the people that go to college don't complete it, the answer can't be to send everyone to college. I think the answer is to send people on the right path, the path that's right for them. And so connecting people to those pathways is a huge, huge focus of workforce development efforts. So much more I could say about that. But those non-skill barriers, I think, really key as well. And when we travel throughout our district, we hear the most about this. We hear about personal barriers like lack of childcare or health. We especially hear about infrastructure like housing and transportation and broadband. Those are things that once jobs are available, connect people to jobs, right? So those are incredibly important focuses. And then there's even incentive problems like benefits cliffs I'll talk about in a second. Aspiration is even an issue. If you haven't seen people that look like you and feel like you be rewarded in the labor market or in the educational system, you might put less into it. And I think we have to pay attention to that incentive. And solving any one of these problems is not, I wish there were a silver bullet, but there's not. They require a host of community and economic development strategies. And just to show you one picture, again, so much more I could say, but this is how educational attainment varies across the Metro Richmond region, right? So incredible variation. So if you think about, if you were to zoom in visually on Eastern Henrico, how versus a child up in Hanover. If you're a child that grows up in one of those places, how likely are you to see someone with an education, to access education, then access a job? How available are the services that connect you to your jobs? So those are the things I think that communities need to think about. And then as we travel throughout the region, I'm going to wrap up in just a moment. What do we see regions with momentum doing? I just want to share some of these observations because it's pretty persistent across regions. One is they talk about regional collaboration. If you view the county next door as your enemy, and we see regions where this happens, it's going to be harder to get things done because all those problems I talked about are regional problems. They're not locality problems, right? Certainly playing to strengths and assets. And here, I think Richmond just has so many advantages. We have a rich history and culture. Is there even more that we can do to embrace and lift up our history, including the difficult parts? Our diversity is a huge asset. Our location is a huge asset. We've got so many amenities here in Richmond, so many assets to work with. We see communities creating a sense of place. You have to make it a place where employers and workers want to be. Really exciting news recently about the Diamond District development along those lines. Telling a good story so that people know about you is important. One of the things I've observed, though, is that telling that story internally is just as important to get people excited about what's going on in your region. That leads to momentum and empowers people to lean into the community in ways that are really, really impactful. Strong leadership is of course critical, and it's not just elected leaders, but being inclusive and growing the next generation of community leaders. That's not just fluff. I mean, there are regions that invest so heavily in leadership and in growing the next generation. And then I think it's worth just noting that taking a long-term view is helpful. Communities that I see that have a lot of momentum build in small wins. They say, let's have a 6-month milestone or a 1-year milestone so that we can lift that up and celebrate it and get people excited about what's going on here. And that moves the ball. So just wanted to share those observations of things I see happening. And then increasingly, more regions are talking about equity and economic mobility. It's not just the conditions you're born into, but how able are you to move up the economic ladder throughout the course of your life. And I just want to share 2 exciting things in Richmond, and then I really will wrap up. One is exercises like the market value analysis that was recently done in Richmond, and there's a link to it here. It's a giant data exercise to create visuals to understand our housing market, how that overlays with race and ethnicity, how that overlays with housing market activity like investor sales and things like that. And you can use data exercises like these to inform your policies. I encourage anyone to spend time on this website. It's just, for a data geek, it's a real treat, but it really is a lot of deep information that can help inform the policies that elected leaders can make. And then coming up tomorrow, we have a Shared Values and Action Summit where Raj Chetty, who is known for pioneering work on economic mobility, is going to come here to Richmond and share what's going on in Richmond. The really exciting thing for an economist like me is there's a lot of research on economic mobility and what regions and communities can do to advance mobility. There's tried and true practices, and it really comes down to even the local neighborhood level. And he's going to share that data, which is so exciting. I promise you it's going to be a compelling session, and most excitingly, an actionable session. So I encourage everyone to attend that. I think it's gonna be really exciting. I just have a list here of some Richmond Fed work. We love to be a partner in this work. At the Fed, we don't write checks to anybody. We can't give out grants or money, but we have to understand the economy very deeply to do the work that we do. So we try to share it as broad and as wide as we can, including shedding light on, where there are systematic things holding back employment. That makes it relevant to the Fed's mandate. And so we do a lot of work on things affecting workforce and employment, and just a sampling of it here. And I'd love to talk to anyone more about that who's interested. We have just an example, some deep work on benefits cliffs. And that's this idea that as you gain training, you might lose dollars in government benefits. It's kind of this perverse, unintended consequence of the layering of government benefits systems. And so we've created a tool, actually, our colleagues at the Atlanta Fed, and we've even worked with the city of Richmond to roll out this tool to help regions think about how they can work around benefits cliffs. Again, something more to talk about. Lots of resources on our website, and I would welcome hearing from anyone at any time with ideas, feedback, requests for information. And that's it. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here today. I'm glad to answer any questions you may have.
Renee, oh my goodness. Thank you so much. Incredible presentation with a lot of information to take in. I had some questions, but the Q&A is blowing up. And so let's maybe head to the Q&A, since we do only have a few minutes left and we have some announcements at the end. And so I'm not sure if you can see them on your end, but let's start here with, do the LFP, which is our labor force participation statistics, include part-timers or just full-timers only?
It includes part-timers, and the labor force participation numbers, it's a household survey. So it's a phone call to households to say, are you working? So that's going to include gig workers, part-time, full-time, any kind of employment, as opposed to payroll job numbers, which are calls to firms. Yes.
Thank you.
Should be inclusive, yeah.
Appreciate that. And then I also have some questions that were coming to me via email or through chat, because you just weren't able to participate in the Q&A. There's a couple people on the phone. I had a question about, how do you see different income groups recovering economically in this post-COVID timeframe? Has the Fed been, tracking income inequality?
Yes, absolutely. And there's so much to say there. Income inequality has grown by any measure, no matter how you cut it. Wealth inequality, income inequality, it's a persistent thing, cuts across racial and ethnic lines. So we do track it because not only is it just important to understand what's going on for different types of individuals, but it has effects on the overall economy as well. So we do track that. And I showed you that chart of household savings, that spiked. And what's really interesting is if you look at the net worth of households by income quartile, even the bottom income quartile has higher net worth relative to pre-pandemic. But that does not mean that everyone's doing fine, right? There are a lot of people on the fringes. I showed you those charts about the share of the population that's employed. Overall numbers don't cover over a lot of variation underneath the surface. So we do pay attention to it. We pay attention to it to see, what are the macroeconomic effects, right? If certain groups are struggling, are they less likely to spend, more likely to fall into credit card debt and whatnot? What are the consumer finance implications, and how does that affect the overall economy? We also look at it from the perspective of our community development mandate, which causes us to focus on low and moderate income communities to figure out what solutions can be brought to them. And there we look at things like access to credit, access to services, and things like that. So much more to say. I can't talk fast enough, but yes, we look at it a great deal.
No, I mean, thank you. There's so much here. One other question that I also saw, and I think this gets at the slide that you shared about regional momentum, and I was so excited to see regional collaboration at the top of that list. What do you see us doing at the regional level in the short term that will make a difference, whether that's, in the short term or that'll make a difference in the next 5 years?
Oh gosh, it's such a rich, rich question. I mean, I think having those conversations where you're working together and finding those areas of momentum and of agreement, I think is a wonderful place to start. So where I mentioned, playing to assets and strengths, what are some places that are getting people excited and where, regional collaboration is not easy, right? There can be differences in incentives. So focusing on places where there is agreement can lead to, and this is not a commentary on Richmond generally, every region I talk to deals with this, leads to trust. If you can make a little progress together, you get more trust together, and then that leads to much more collaboration going forward. That trust piece actually matters a great deal, and it's a headache to economists because you can't quantify that, but it's real, and I hear every region talking about it. So finding where you can work together, lifting that up and leading that to the next thing, just moving that ball bit by bit.
Thank you so much. Appreciate that. So thank you again, Renee, for joining us today. Thank you for our audience for being here. We hope you enjoyed our webinar, and we look forward to the information that will be available. There are just so many great things happening in the Richmond region, and the Better Together webinar is a platform to highlight everyday heroes like Renee that are working to make the Richmond region a safer and more equitable place for all to thrive. Just a few announcements, and Sid, if you want to share our closing slide. Like Renee said, so we have a Shared Values and Action Summit that is tomorrow with internationally acclaimed economist Raj Chetty. That will be at the Dominion Energy Center at 8:30 a.m. Registration, it's a free event, but we do ask you to register, and Sid has that link. He'll drop it in the chat, but we'll also send out this information later. October is Disability Awareness Month, so please join us on October 20th for our next Better Together webinar. We'll be speaking with Matthew Shapiro, who is the founder and CEO of Six Wheels Consulting. Civic Action Conversations is hosting a virtual webinar about affordable housing, why it matters and what you can do. That will be on Wednesday, October 26th. And there'll be, again, a link to register for that. We would also love for you to stay connected with PlanRVA by following us on Facebook, on LinkedIn, Twitter, and YouTube. We've also launched a blog and a newsletter, but it has just been incredible to have Renee here to level set us of how we're doing as a region, what we can do going forward. And as the African proverb goes, if you want to go fast, go alone, but if you want to go far, go together. And at PlanRVA, we believe we are better together. See you all next time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.